Hi, this is Seriously Good News. I'm Ed Sims, and today I'm looking at some of the parables of Jesus. They're found in Matthew's Gospel, and I'm going to be reading from chapter 13, verses 31 through 33, and then 44 through 52. He, Jesus, put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of all shrubs and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Told him another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found and which a man found and reburied, then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets and threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all of this? They answered, Yes. And he said to them, Therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. It's no wonder that Matthew is called the teaching gospel. It was written to explain that Jesus of Nazareth is, in fact, the biblical fulfillment of the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. That he is the Messiah that has been anticipated and hoped for a long, long time. Matthew carefully groups Jesus' teachings into 5 big lessons. In doing so, he was creating a symmetry to the first 5 books of the Bible, called the 5 books of Moses. In fact, Jesus is described as the new Moses and even greater than Moses. Matthew wanted to make sure that the message of Jesus was very clear and easy to follow. It's designed to teach us, followers of Jesus, how to live into the good life, the abundant life, eternal life. Today's scriptures come toward the end of the second big lesson, which concerns sharing the good news of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus presents a series of 7 parables, teaching stories. We are called to boldly sow the seeds of the kingdom because when it takes root, it will bring a yield that is impressive, amazing even. In other words, sowing the seeds of the kingdom will bring rewards that are impressive, amazing even. Here toward the end of Jesus' second big lesson, it's like he backed a truck up and began dumping out parables, one after another, each one telling us more about God's kingdom and how precious it is, that if you can obtain it, you have everything. These parables are bookended by stories of opposition to the mission of Jesus. But Jesus had already forewarned his followers that when they take up his mission, which is bringing healing, being an agent of peace, and pointing out the presence of God's activity in our midst, not everyone is going to be willing to accept that message. But Jesus says, don't worry. Shake the dust off your feet and keep on going. Keep on sowing the good seeds of God's kingdom. Sometimes seed won't fall on good ground. Sometimes enemies will sow bad seed to corrupt your efforts because evil is real. But only God has the big picture, so leave the judging to God and you keep on sowing the good seeds of God's kingdom because the kingdom will be good, better than you can imagine, impressive, amazing even. Jesus tells these stories in order to teach us what life can be like when we turn to God in order to change our hearts and lives. when we allow God to rule in our lives, as in reality, God is ruling in all creation. We just don't always see it. Matthew describes this life as being a part of the kingdom of heaven. Remember, for us modern disciples, heaven can be a bit of a sidetracking label. When we hear leaven, when we hear heaven, it kicks in our Sunday school upbringing, which takes us to images of heaven with pearly gates and streets of gold and angels with harps and eternal singing. So we have to make a mental and spiritual adjustment to really hear what Jesus is saying. Because he's not talking about what life will be like after we die. He's talking about what life can be like right here and right now, if we are willing to get on board with God's vision for what this world can and should be like. Because the kingdom will be good, better than you can imagine, impressive, amazing, even. And it can start with the smallest things. And that brings us to today's scriptures, which is like a cascade of many parables. We begin today's reading with what is one of Jesus' most well-known parables, the mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's tiny, but it becomes huge, a place of haven and rest. Now, if you get caught up in the details, asking things like, is the mustard seed really the smallest of all seeds? And does it really grow into a tree? Then you're asking the wrong questions. You've missed the point. The right question is, what does it mean? God's kingdom can begin with the smallest things. The smallest seeds of goodness that you sow can have eternal consequences. You may never know the full impact of the things that God has helped you to do. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's like yeast. It's like a treasure in a field. It's like one very precious pearl. It's like a big, big net that sorts it all out in the end. In other words, God's presence may seem small, but it's huge. God's presence may be hard to detect, but it's in everything. God's presence changes everything. God's presence is worth everything. And in the end, God's presence is going to sort out everything, and it will all be worthwhile. I love it. I find such comfort in these parables. I find such encouragement in these parables. These parables make me want to be a part of God's kingdom. I long for God's kingdom, don't you? I long for God's kingdom because the world we live in is so messed up. I live in a world where evil is rampant. I live in a world where it's okay to hate someone just because they don't look like me. They're different from me. They don't come from here. I live in a world where the ultra rich live by a completely different set of rules, where bullies always win. I live in a world where the gaslighting begins at sunup and doesn't end until the darkness swallows us. I live in a world where those in leadership have done their darndest to dismantle truth and safety and security and trust. I live in a world where it feels like we need to carry a gun and not be afraid to use it. I live in a world where people feel free to declare what we can and cannot say, or read, or pray, or do to express ourselves. I need God's presence. I long for God's kingdom. I need the kingdom of heaven to be like a census in which everyone counts, no matter how small. I need the presence of God to help me know how I can live my life in such a way that I can respect and care for others and for my planet. I need the presence of God to free me from the bondage of my sinful self-centeredness. I need the presence of God to free me from anger and resentment and an insatiable hunger for vengeance. I need the kingdom of heaven to catch me and hug me into the embrace of a loving God. If the presence of God could become that immediate, that tangible, that real, then it would be the most precious, the dearest, the most valuable thing in the world. If I had that, I would have everything. And that's what these parables are about. Listen again. Here's what they say in a nutshell. God's presence may seem small, but it's huge. God's presence may be hard to detect, but it's in everything. God's presence changes everything. God's presence is worth everything. And in the end, God's presence is going to sort out everything, and it will all be worthwhile. So when I ask myself the question, do I want to be a part of that? Do I want to be a part of God's plan? Do I want to be a part of God's rule? Do I want to be a part of God's kingdom? Then my answer is a resounding yes, I'm in. In the scripture, when Jesus finished telling his disciples all of these parables, he asked them, have you understood all this? In my mind's eye, Jesus is very amused by their response because I see them all nodding in unison. Yes. It's amusing because we know how little they really understood. That they could think that such a thing would come without a cost, and that the cost would be the cross. We know how little they understood from the way they acted and the things that they said. They kept on arguing about who was the greatest. And then, when Jesus was arrested, they ran away. And they went into hiding and cowered in fear of the authorities after Jesus was killed. And to tell the truth, if I'm honest, I have to admit how little I understand. When I look at the way that I act and the things that I say, when I act and speak without thinking, when I consider how much I'm a part of the structures of race and class without even being aware of it, when I consider how I've done so little to care for God's creation and how small my efforts are at being a good steward of all that God has provided. It's like when I declare with the disciples, yes, I'm in, I would imagine that it amuses Jesus greatly. But Jesus' response to his frail and fallible disciples gives me such encouragement. He said, therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Now, that's a bit of a cryptic response, although I have to admit, Jesus has been a little cryptic in all of these parables. But what I think it means is this. If you understand this, if you get this, if you have this, then you have everything. If you can become a part, if you can become aware of God's presence in your life, the presence of God becomes real in your life, then you have everything. And that's enough. See you next time.